December 20th, 1943. A B-17 flying fortress called Lucky Strike struggled across the icy English Channel, flying on 3 engines and stubborn willpower. Its number 3 engine was gone, not just dead, but ripped completely away by an 88mm flak burst over Bremen that tore a ragged hole through the right wing. Hydraulic fluid streamed in crimson trails along the fuselage, glinting in the winter light. The ball turret hung twisted, its gunner already gone. By every Army Air Forces manual and every physical law of flight, the aircraft should have dropped into the North Sea 20 minutes earlier. Yet it stayed airborne. Lieutenant Marcus Webb gripped the control yoke with frozen hands, coaxing a response from instruments that flickered like dying candles. Beside him, the co-pilot called out failing pressures, zero hydraulics, erratic fuel flow, unreliable electrics. The bomber was, by all reason, a corpse in the sky. When Lucky Strike finally reached the coast of England and lined up for RAF Bassingbourn, the surviving systems gave their last. Only the left main gear deployed. The right remained jammed in its bay, hydraulic pressure exhausted. Webb lowered the fortress toward the runway anyway. Metal screamed as the belly met concrete, sparks shooting down the tarmac in a trail visible from the control tower. Crash crews braced for fire and death. Instead, they watched 8 men climb out, battered, bloodied, but alive. The 9th, the ball turret gunner, was gone. Colonel James Albertson, commander of the 351st Bomb Group, stared at the ruined bomber, its fuselage scored with shrapnel scars and its wing half torn away. Against every expectation, it had brought its crew home. He asked the question every man on the flight line was thinking: how? The official investigation would take months. The real answer was already at work a few hundred yards away in Hangar 3, where a stocky mechanic with oil-blackened fingers was buried elbow-deep in another B-17's engine cowling. His name was Staff Sergeant Paul Zook, and his unapproved modifications had quietly changed the odds of survival for everyone who flew. In late 1943, the Army Air Forces faced a crisis it could not describe in after-action reports. Bombers were being lost in predictable, preventable ways. Crews expected to face fighters and flak, but too many aircraft were failing from damage that shouldn't have been fatal. One fragment through the wrong section of tubing could doom a fortress built to withstand entire squadrons of Messerschmitts. Something fundamental in the design philosophy was wrong. Boeing denied it. The Pentagon refused to slow production, and men kept dying. The survival of Lucky Strike was no miracle. It was proof that one mechanic had found the flaw and fixed it, not in a laboratory or factory, but with scavenged parts, intuition, and stubborn disregard for regulations. Paul Zook was not supposed to be anywhere near airplanes. His aptitude tests marked him for the motor pool, trucks, jeeps, generators, the unglamorous machines that kept airfields running. But a clerk at Bassingbourn noticed his pre-war work history and reassigned him to aircraft maintenance. That minor clerical act would save hundreds of lives. Before the war, Zook had run a small garage in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood. He kept coal trucks, delivery vans, and the occasional bootlegger's hot rod Ford alive through the Great Depression, when spare parts were dreams and ingenuity was survival. His shop lived by a single rule: make it work, or it doesn't get fixed. When he arrived in England in August 1943, 26 years old, calloused and impatient, he carried that rule with him. During his first week on the flight line, he watched a crew chief ground a B-17 for a cracked hydraulic line. The part was on back order, the plane stayed idle. Zook asked why they couldn't bypass the brake and reroute the pressure through the secondary line. The chief looked at him as though he were insane. "That's not in the manual," he said. Zook answered in the thick Pittsburgh accent that became legend on the base. "The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks in the Depression. I did." That sentence defined him. Where trained mechanics saw orders, Zook saw systems. Where others saw procedure, he saw possibility. His genius lay in understanding how things could keep working when half of them were already broken. By October 1943, quiet rumors began circulating. Aircraft Zook had serviced were returning from missions others hadn't. One bomber limped back after flak shredded its hydraulic bay, but somehow landed with gear down. Another lost its electrical bus to cannon fire, yet kept enough power to bring its navigator home. Some called it coincidence. Zuck called it redundancy. He began staying late in the hangar, studying damage patterns on returning bombers. The photographs in Boeing's manuals showed perfect systems operating under perfect conditions. The wrecks on his flight line told another story, of hydraulic lines severed where they'd been neatly bundled for efficiency, of fuel systems cascading into total failure from a single puncture, of electrical circuits designed with no backup at all. The B-17 had earned a reputation for invincibility in 1942. Newspapers printed photographs of fortresses limping home with wings full of holes, proof that American engineering could endure anything. But by autumn 1943, the numbers said otherwise. The 8th Air Force was losing 5% of its bombers on every mission. Crews had to fly 25 missions for a full tour. Mathematically, their chance of surviving was a coin flip. Something besides enemy fire was killing them. Zook examined the wrecks and found the truth hiding in plain sight. The first killer was hydraulics. The B-17 system controlled everything that mattered: landing gear, brakes, wing flaps, even the powered turrets. Boeing had designed it for factory efficiency. Main lines ran together through the fuselage in tidy bundles, easy to install and inspect. But that neatness created vulnerability. One well-placed fragment could drain pressure to multiple systems at once. Crews with 3 working engines and intact wings were dying because they couldn't lower their gear or deploy flaps. The second weakness was the fuel system. Each fortress carried 2,180 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in 9 tanks, 5 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. Lines between them passed directly through the zones most often hit by enemy fire. A single 20mm shell could puncture a line and spray vaporized gasoline inside the fuselage. Even without fire, air bubbles entered the system, causing vapor lock. Engines began to cough, then fail in sequence, starved of fuel from a network that had no isolation valves. The third vulnerability was electrical. Every major system relied on a single main power bus. One hit, and the fortress went dark. No radio, no instruments, no turrets, nothing. Boeing's design worked flawlessly under controlled conditions. Over Germany, those conditions did not exist. Zook saw the problem for what it was. The flying fortress had been built to succeed when everything went right, not to survive when everything went wrong. So he started fixing it. He scavenged undamaged hydraulic tubing from wrecks in the salvage yard, pressure-tested them with a hand pump he'd built from spare fittings, and used them to create alternate routes through the fuselage. He placed the lines along structural members where they were less likely to be hit. He installed manual isolation valves near the cockpit so pilots could shut off a damaged section and restore pressure through the backup path. The system was messy, heavier, and entirely against regulations. But it worked. Next, he tackled the fuel network. Using surplus petcock valves meant for ground refueling, he installed cross-feed lines between tanks and labeled them as refueling check valves on maintenance logs. Technically true, deliberately misleading. In-flight, crews could now isolate a leaking tank and reroute fuel from intact ones directly to the engines that needed it. Finally, he rewired the electrical system. He ran secondary lines from the auxiliary generator straight to critical instruments and communications equipment, bypassing the main bus entirely. He hid them inside existing cable bundles, insulating them in yellow instead of black so aircrews could identify them as emergency power circuits. He wrote none of this down. Officially, none of it existed. By regulation, what he was doing constituted unauthorized modification of combat aircraft, an offense punishable by court-martial if a failure could be traced to it. He did it anyway. "Those guys fly the missions," he said later. "The least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home." By January 1944, Zook had quietly modified 17 B-17s in the 351st Bomb Group. He didn't advertise, didn't ask permission. He simply worked the night shift until dawn, flashlight between his teeth, rewriting the fortress from the inside out. The planes he touched started returning at rates that defied statistics. The change in survival rates among Zook's aircraft didn't go unnoticed. Crews whispered about it first, then officers began to see it in the numbers. The bombers serviced in Hangar 3 kept returning home when, By all reason they shouldn't have. One B-17 came back from Hamburg with half its right wing missing and its hydraulic system riddled with holes, yet its landing gear lowered flawlessly. Another lost its electrical main bus to a 20mm cannon shell, but the instrument stayed alive long enough for the navigator to guide it safely back to Bassingbourn. These aircraft bore scars that should have made them coffins, yet they refused to die. To Zuck, the reason was simple. He had given them second chances. He never spoke of what he was doing beyond a few trusted men who helped him after hours. To everyone else, he was just the stubborn Pittsburgh mechanic who never clocked out on time. Then, on February 8, 1944, the secret began to unravel. Captain Ronald Fletcher, the 351st Engineering Officer, was conducting routine inspections, standard procedure to ensure that maintenance crews were following technical orders. When he opened the hydraulic access panel of a B-17 called Devil's Daughter, he froze. Inside was a maze of tubing and valves that had no business being there. Secondary lines wound through the fuselage. Manual cut-offs sat on handmade brackets, and fuel crossovers were patched together from parts clearly scavenged off other aircraft. Yet it wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate. The work was clean, functional, and consistent with a design philosophy Fletcher didn't recognize. Fletcher had trained as an aeronautical engineer at MIT before the war. He knew Boeing blueprints by heart, and what he was looking at wasn't on any of them. He asked around the hangar and quickly heard the same name: Zuck. When Fletcher found him, Zuck was working on an engine swap, arms covered in oil. The officer held his clipboard tightly and said, "Sergeant, we need to talk about Devil's Daughter." Zuck didn't even look up. "What about her?" "About the fact," Fletcher replied, "that she's got 40 feet of hydraulic line that doesn't exist in any technical manual, fitted with valves that aren't authorized for flight use." Zuck set down his wrench, wiped his hands and stared at Fletcher without blinking. "You want the official answer or the real one?" "The real one," Fletcher said. 17 aircraft, Zuck replied simply. Fletcher's heart sank. 17 B-17s in active service had undocumented modifications to their primary systems. If a single one failed in flight, both of them could face courts-martial. But something made Fletcher hesitate. "Have any of them had hydraulic failures?" he asked. Zuck pulled a grease-stained notebook from his coveralls. Inside were handwritten notes, serial numbers, damage reports, pressure readings, pilot remarks. 3 took flak hits through the main lines, he said. All 3 came home. The backup systems held. Fletcher did the math in his head. Statistically, 2 of those planes should have been lost. He closed the notebook and said, "Stay where you are." By noon, he was in Colonel Albertson's office. By mid-afternoon, Albertson himself was in the hangar inspecting Devil's Daughter. What he saw was undeniable. Zook had broken every rule in the book and saved lives doing it. The colonel could already imagine the storm this would cause up the chain of command. That evening, the base's senior officers gathered to debate Zuck's fate. Should they court-martial him for violating technical orders or commend him for innovation? No one could decide. 2 days later, Major Henry Watkins from the 8th Air Force Engineering Division arrived to conduct a formal investigation. Watkins spent 3 days crawling through Zuck's aircraft, photographing installations and interviewing crews. He listened to pilots describe the difference between flying a standard Fortress and one of Zuck's modified birds. "You can feel it," one pilot said. "When something gets hit, the airplane still listens." Watkins's preliminary report, filed on February 13th, was careful but revolutionary. While Staff Sergeant Zuck's modifications are unauthorized and in violation of standing technical orders, it read, preliminary analysis suggests these changes address systemic vulnerabilities in hydraulic and fuel system design that may contribute to combat losses. Recommend suspension of punitive action pending controlled testing. That single paragraph changed everything. It prevented Zook's immediate punishment and, more importantly, forced the Air Force to confront a question it had ignored. Had its most celebrated bomber been built with fatal weaknesses? Colonel Albertson, pragmatic as ever, made a decision that stretched the rules but stopped short of breaking them. Zook would not be punished, but he would stop modifying planes until an evaluation could be completed. Meanwhile, his 17 unauthorized bombers would continue to fly combat missions because even the most cautious officer could read survival statistics. In early March 1944, Major Watkins returned to Bassingbourn accompanied by 2 Boeing engineers and a team of Air Force technical specialists. Their orders were simple: determine whether Zook's work was genius or recklessness, and do it fast. The Boeing engineers were civilians, veterans of the original B-17 design team. When they saw Zook's work, they were appalled. The lead engineer, a man named Carlson, pointed at the new hydraulic runs and called them contamination risks. He described the manual valves as potential catastrophic failure points and lectured about flow stability and pressure regulation. Zook stood quietly, wiping his hands on a rag darker than the oil stains on his sleeves. When Carlson finished, Zook asked, "When's the last time you flew a mission?" Carlson bristled. "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." Zook nodded once. "That's what I figured. You designed this thing in Seattle, where the worst thing that happens is a pressure leak on the test stand. I fix it when it comes back with holes in it. Different world." Watkins understood both men, and he proposed a radical compromise. They would test Zook's modifications under real combat conditions. A handful of his aircraft would be fitted with additional gauges and data recorders, flown on live missions and monitored on return. If the systems failed, the issue would be settled. If they worked, the Air Force would have to admit that a sergeant from Pittsburgh had out-engineered Boeing. There was no time for months of controlled trials. The air war over Germany was entering its peak. The 8th Air Force was losing hundreds of bombers every week. They needed answers now. Between March 5 and March 18th, 5 of Zook's modified B-17s flew 11 combat missions to Berlin, Brunswick, Friedrichshafen and other heavily defended targets. Each carried extra instrumentation, recording hydraulic pressure, fuel flow and electrical performance. 3 of the aircraft took significant battle damage. All 5 returned. The most dramatic test came on March 18, 1944. A B-17 nicknamed Memphis Belle II took a direct 88mm hit through the bomb bay, severing its primary hydraulic line exactly where Boeing's blueprints routed it. Onboard sensors recorded pressure dropping from 1200 psi to 0 in 4.2 seconds. According to standard procedures, the bomber should have lost control of its flaps, landing gear, and brakes. But the pilot, briefed by Zook himself, reached for 3 small manual valves installed under the cockpit. He turned them in sequence. Pressure returned to 85% of normal. The crew completed their bombing run, rejoined formation, and landed safely back at Bassingbourn. In the hangar, engineers watched the data playback in silence. Carlson, the Boeing man who had mocked Zook's work, stared at the numbers and finally said, "This shouldn't work. The pressure dynamics are wrong, the flow rates are off, and the filtration isn't adequate. But it does work." Zook, leaning in the doorway, replied quietly, "It works because I built it for when everything's already gone to hell. Yours works great until it doesn't. Mine works bad all the time, but it keeps working." Watkins's final report ran to 47 pages of data and analysis. Its conclusion was unambiguous. Zook modifications increase system survivability without degrading operational performance. Recommend field authorization and group-level mechanic training. That recommendation set off a chain reaction across the entire 8th Air Force. While Washington argued over procurement channels and Boeing negotiated retrofit contracts, word spread the only way that mattered: mechanic to mechanic, base to base. At Molesworth, Staff Sergeant Mike Delacroix of the 303rd Bomb Group heard rumors of Zook's work from a friend transferred from Bassingbourn. During a supply run in early April, he tracked Zook down, notebook in hand. Zook spent 3 hours showing him every detail: the valve placements, the rerouted lines, the logic behind each modification. Delacroix returned to his base and started copying the system that same night. Within a week, 5 bombers at Molesworth had the new plumbing. From there, the idea spread to Thorpe Abbotts, where the 100th Bomb Group, nicknamed the Bloody 100th for its devastating losses, began installing the same modifications without waiting for authorization. They didn't need permission. They'd seen too many aircraft go down because of failures that should have been survivable. By mid-April, Zook's design philosophy had become a quiet revolution spreading across East Anglia. The 379th Bomb Group at Kimbolton began keeping unofficial statistics. Before the modifications, their mechanical abort rate hovered around 14%. Within a month, it dropped to 6%. Their data also showed something even more important. Bombers that took damage and carried the full suite of modifications were 3 times more likely to return home. On April 28, 1944, the Air Force finally caught up to the field. Technical Order 0120EG2127 was issued, authorizing field installation of redundant hydraulic lines and manual isolation valves in B-17F and B-17G aircraft. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but its meaning was historic. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces officially sanctioned a system born not in a design bureau, but on a hangar floor. Yet even as Zook read the order, he laughed. It covered only the hydraulic system. His fuel and electrical modifications, equally vital, remained forbidden. Headquarters called them unnecessary and potentially unsafe. Zook's response was simple: tell that to the guys flying. That night, he went back to work. By May 1944, at least 120 aircraft across 7 bomb groups carried the full Zuck modification package. The official count, those installed under the new technical order, was just 41. The rest were quietly added by mechanics who had learned the same lesson Zook had. Sometimes the manual had to be ignored for men to make it home. By early May 1944, the results were becoming impossible to ignore. Mechanics across England were now working through the night, copying Zook's designs by hand and sharing them across units. At Bassingbourn, Zook's own 351st Bomb Group had become a testing ground for the concept of battlefield engineering. The crews trusted their mechanics like never before. Pilots requested Zuck by name when they learned their next mission target was deep in Germany. "If Zuck's touched it," one airman said, "it'll get us home." The numbers backed up the faith. Before the modifications, the 351st had lost nearly 4 aircraft per 100 sorties. By late May, that figure had dropped to just over 2. That difference, a mere percentage point and a half on paper, translated to dozens of crews alive instead of dead. Across the 8th Air Force, whispers of the Pittsburgh fix spread like wildfire. Colonel Albertson, now certain that Zuck's work was responsible for the group's extraordinary survival rates, decided to bring the evidence to higher command. In early June, he invited the Air Force Statistical Analysis Section to Bassingbourn to review the data. The visiting analyst pored over maintenance logs, after-action reports, and mission results. What they found startled them. Aircraft with the full set of modifications were surviving catastrophic damage at rates that far exceeded expectations. Their report, filed on June 9, 1944, contained a single sentence that would echo through engineering circles for decades. Statistical correlation between modified aircraft and improved survivability is significant beyond normal variance and warrants expanded implementation. In plain English, it worked, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and the war didn't wait. Even as headquarters debated the next steps, the mechanics in the field kept going. In the dark hangars of East Anglia, wrenches turned and torches hissed as crews quietly installed hydraulic bypasses, fuel crossovers, and emergency power lines into bombers bound for combat. Some did it from conviction, others from superstition, but all of them understood one truth: a Zook-modified fortress came home. As the Allies intensified their air campaign in preparation for the Normandy invasion, the effects of Zook's work became visible across the 8th Air Force. Bombers that would once have been written off as lost now limped back with wounded systems but living crews. Landing fields across England filled with battered, smoke-trailing fortresses that still managed to land on their wheels, still had pressure in their hydraulics, still had fuel reaching their engines when, by all right, they shouldn't have had any. Officially, the Air Force credited improved tactics, tighter formations, and escort fighters. Unofficially, the men who worked the line knew better. They were fixing planes in ways that weren't supposed to be possible, and it was saving lives. By June 1944, the Zook modifications had spread so widely that they no longer belonged to any one man. Every airfield had its own version, each slightly different, adapted from scrounged materials, field-tested under fire, and perfected by necessity. Mechanics from different bases met in pubs or supply depots, swapping sketches drawn on the backs of ration boxes. They called it the plumber's trick, the second line, or simply Zook's way. And still Boeing and the Pentagon hesitated. Only the hydraulic system modification had been formally approved. The fuel and electrical systems remained in limbo, but even as they debated, the evidence mounted. At the 379th Bomb Group in Kimballton, Master Sergeant Robert Chen kept meticulous notes. His personal log showed that in March, before any of the modifications, the group's mechanical abort rate was 14%. By late April, with 12 aircraft running the full Zook system, it dropped to 6%. More importantly, damaged aircraft were returning to base at triple the previous rate. Chen didn't need statistical software. He had seen it with his own eyes. By late summer, the transformation was undeniable. Across East Anglia, maintenance crews no longer waited for official orders. They simply did what worked. In truth, by July 1944, almost every bomber group operating out of England had aircraft that bore the fingerprints of Zook's ideas, and the results were staggering. In the 351st Bomb Group, Zook's own, the loss rate had fallen to 2.1%, nearly half the 8th Air Force average. In the air war over Europe, that small percentage represented hundreds of lives. Even Colonel Albertson, who had once stood ready to court-martial Zook, now became his quiet advocate. In briefings, he called Zook's work practical genius, the kind of innovation that headquarters could neither design nor regulate. And though few outside the engineering corps ever learned the name, within the maintenance ranks it became legend. By August 1944, the impact of Zook's ideas had rippled beyond the B-17. The same principles, redundant hydraulics, alternate fuel feeds, secondary electrical buses, began appearing in other aircraft. P-51 Mustang squadrons installed modified fuel crossovers. B-24 Liberator mechanics began running backup pressure lines. The idea had transcended the man. Build systems that keep working when everything else fails. Through the remainder of 1944 and into 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, Zook's modifications quietly became the backbone of bomber survivability. For every fortress that came home with its hydraulics shot out but its landing gear still lowered, for every crew that survived a mission because the backup fuel feed kept one engine running, there was a trace of his fingerprints. When the war ended in May 1945, the data spoke for itself. The 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 men during the bombing campaign, but thousands more were alive because of a single sergeant's unauthorized ingenuity. 3 months later, in August 1945, Captain Dorothy Henshaw, a statistician at Air Force headquarters, compiled the definitive analysis. She compared mission logs, maintenance records, and survival data from every B-17 group. Her findings were remarkable. Units that had adopted Zook's full suite of modifications, hydraulic, fuel, and electrical, showed a 23.4% higher rate of aircraft return compared to their pre-modification period. That figure represented 347 bombers that came home instead of being lost. Multiply that by 10 men per crew, and you had between 3,000 and 4,000 airmen who lived. Henshaw's report went further. Among aircraft sustaining severe damage, classified as Category 3, requiring major system replacement, those with Zook's modifications returned 81% of the time. Unmodified aircraft with similar damage survived only 47% of the time. The difference between those numbers was not theoretical, it was measured in human lives. Zook, however, never saw himself as a hero. When the war ended, he was discharged with the rank of Technical Sergeant and awarded a Commendation Medal for exceptional mechanical proficiency. The citation never mentioned the forbidden modifications that had defined his contribution. He returned home to Pittsburgh, reopened his garage on Polish Hill, and went back to fixing cars and trucks. For the next 30 years he worked quietly, rarely speaking about the war. To his neighbors, he was just Paul the mechanic, the man who could fix anything with an engine. In 1973, Air Force historian Dr. Michael Torres tracked Zook down while researching wartime field innovations. He spent 3 days in Pittsburgh interviewing him and poring over the grease-stained notebooks Zook had kept throughout the war. 47 volumes filled with sketches, equations, and handwritten notes. When Torres asked why he had risked a court-martial to make unauthorized changes, Zook's answer was blunt and simple. Didn't seem risky to me. Guys were dying because the planes weren't built right. I could fix that or I could follow the manual. Easy choice. Those notebooks, 47 in all, were later donated to the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. They remain there today, filed quietly in the research archives. Each one contains hand-drawn schematics of bypass systems, fuel rerouting designs, and electrical redundancies that foreshadowed the post-war evolution of aircraft safety. Even Boeing eventually caught up. Late production B-17G models incorporated redundant hydraulic routing and isolated fuel circuits directly inspired by field observations from Europe. The post-war B-29 Superfortress and later B-50 incorporated similar concepts as standard design features. Official documentation credited engineering refinements resulting from combat experience. But those who knew the truth understood the lineage traced back to a grease-covered sergeant who had learned his trade fixing trucks during the Depression. In 1954, the original Lucky Strike, the aircraft that had proven Zook's work, was finally scrapped. But photographs of its hydraulic bay, taken during the 1944 engineering evaluation, lived on. They appeared for years in Air Force maintenance training manuals, labeled only as field-developed redundancy modifications. Generations of mechanics learned from those images without ever knowing the name behind them. Paul Zuck died in 1989 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned only that he was a veteran and owner of Zuck's Auto Repair. It said nothing of the thousands of airmen who owed their lives to his defiance. But within the archives, his legacy remains written in oil and pencil, in calculations scrawled in the margins, and in the simple logic that guided his hands. He never saw himself as an inventor, but his work had changed aviation forever. The forbidden fix became standard practice, the Maverick became a model, and the lesson endured long after the war ended. Sometimes the people closest to the problem see the truth that those in distant offices never can. Engineering is not about perfection, it's about survival. Paul Zook didn't design for when everything went right. He designed for when everything went wrong. And because of that, thousands of men came home. And that is the forgotten story of Staff Sergeant Paul Zuck, the mechanic who rewrote the laws of survival, not in a design lab, but in a cold hangar under the roar of bombers. He wasn't a general or a decorated ace. He was a man with a wrench, a conscience, and the courage to do what manuals said was impossible. While others designed for perfection, he designed for chaos. While engineers trusted equations, he trusted experience. And when regulations said no, he quietly saved thousands of men who never even knew his name. History often remembers those who flew, but not those who made flight possible. Men like Zook never stood in parades, never gave speeches, and never asked for credit. But because of them, fathers came home, letters were delivered, and wars ended a little sooner. At Reknox, we don't just tell stories. We uncover truths buried under dust and silence. Stories of courage that never made it into textbooks. Stories that remind us that real heroes aren't always the ones in medals. Sometimes they're the ones with grease on their hands. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history, then remember to like this video, share it, and subscribe to Reknox, where we bring to life the untold human side of war, one forgotten story at a time. Because here, at Reknox, we don't rewrite history. We remember